They really do vary. Got one grape called Dolcetto that doesn't want to be touched at all. It's very finicky. So then you get into clones and what your goal is. All these other different things, adding this, subtracting that. Eventually you get to the end of fermentation. So most of your sugars become alcohol at that point. The wines go from being sort of a mix of white juice, because most grapes have white interiors and it's just the skin that has the color, to being dark red, very purple when things are fresh. And you're getting, the yeast are tired. Sometimes you have to heat the tank up to get it to finish. The yeast are just, they're exhausted. They're not. The finish line is in sight, but they start moving very slowly. When your fermentation starts taking off, after you've crushed and maybe you've added yeast, we're always trying to slow it down because it's going too fast. Once that sugar is gone, we want to speed it up and get it finished. So it kind of change gears a little bit. Pressing wine, then you have the whole, or do you have a big hydraulic press? Do you have a fancy sideways press? You'll see a bunch of different models in the different wineries. A lot of them are big sideways ones. And then what do you do with the grapes after? If you're building a winery, first thing you want to think about is sanitation. How do you keep everything as clean as possible? And of course, things do get dirty during harvest, but you want to do the best you can to keep everything fresh and bright. Now that I've said that, I know a winemaker who makes amazing natural wines. He's one of the originators up in the Sierra foothills. He doesn't allow any cleaning agents at all in his cellar. Barrels, nothing, just water. Gideon is a crazy Israeli artist guy. He's been doing the same things for 20 years. And if you ever get to try the Clos Syrah wines, you should try them. They're very unique. All of this, he believes in the opposite. And he gets amazing wines out of it. He's also made a lot of wines that never hit the market. But he's willing to take that risk. And he's one of the people that I would say, wow, this is somebody who took it from an art to a craft. Or I'm sorry, from a craft, like I'm just a craftsman, to an actual art form. So, very long-term goal. But then you get into the whole barrel aging thing. You'll see stacks and stacks and stacks of barrels. Those are most of Italy, a lot of France, they don't use these barrels. And we expect to see it. It's the lifeblood of the industry. I buy used barrels for $50 from somebody I trust, and it's the most economical way to do things. If you go to, well, I guess southern Italy now, but old world winemaking regions, lots of times it's concrete tanks, very huge wood barrels, big ovals, casks. In California, out just south of Cloverdale, Italian Swiss colony, they had, I think, literally 100,000 gallon redwood tanks that they were aging wine in. Like, I don't even know how you construct something like that and make it fluid type, but this sort of Bordeaux barrel model is a peculiar thing that we all do. It could have been different. If I had my way, I would only have concrete tanks. I love how concrete affects the texture of the wine. But those are choices you would make. How do you age your barrels? Then eventually, how do you get it into the bottle? Bottling lines, incredibly expensive, take a lot of effort. We hand bottle our wines, 2 people. We can do 300 cases in a 14-hour shift. So I was talking to somebody that works for Gallo just yesterday in the tasting room. They do 300 bottles a minute. And then they have a railway system in Modesto within the Gallo plant. They actually put things on a train to take it to the other part of the Gallo plant. Crazy, remarkable, amazing. So let's take a quick break, but that's just a quick and dirty overview of some of the viticulture and the enology side of the business. And feel free to shout out any questions you have about it too, and we can pick up when we come back.
There is a little restroom right here, and there's a restroom in the lobby of the hotel, or you can stretch your legs for about 7 minutes or so.
Does anybody want to go outside? Water? Yeah, please. I'll pour it. I've got a bottle, so. I ask you a question about oak barrels? And you got the types of white and red, and red barrels. And the French, what they refer to in these barrels, they say French oak or American oak. And the French oak, I forget where's the species, but it's a red oak, which would have more tannin than the US. A white oak, but yet these things like on California, now I know it's from old school, I like the taste. But it was like, okay, I did it in a French barrel, so therefore it won't have the oaky taste, but then it comes from the tannin. It's almost like a reverse.
Amazingly complex discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am not a chemist. I don't understand the chicken wire involved. But some of these barrels have a peculiar effect of, yeah, they contain a lot of tannin, and somehow, by working with the tannin present in the wine, you end up with actually a smoother, more full-bodied wine 18 months down the road.
But it was just like you would
It's
think the
remarkable.
white oak had less tannin, so therefore you wouldn't have it. The tannin will leach out.
Which it does too.
So it's like this thing where somebody's, oh, it's French oak, therefore it's.
Yeah.
And the American, and I'm saying, well, okay, if I had a new French oak, which would be more tannin, and a 20-year-old American oak, you
Yeah.
would think that it would have less.
The weird thing is that all the tannin has a different shape though too. We'll talk about that in a little bit,
Yeah.
but each grape
I think,
feels different.
yeah, just.
Yeah,
Anyway.
that's a whole other art that I can't teach, but I'm fascinated by that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I just heard you say tannin.
Mhm.
The white wine doesn't have tannin?
Generally not, because it comes from the skin and the seeds, and when you make a white wine, you separate it very quickly from those two things, so it's just juice.
Okay.
It can have a little bit sometimes if it's aged in barrel, and some winemakers will actually age or add a little bit of tannin, or you can let the wine sort of sit on the skins for maybe 6 hours and then press it and separate it to add a little bit of palate grip, just enough. Like you usually don't notice it, but it can be there.
And I have two other things. You were talking about the sulfur, the sulfites that wine has. And I always thought that's why you get headaches, because of the sulfites.
Yeah,
So,
possibly.
possibly.
There's a lot of other stuff too.
But when you buy a $6.99 bottle of wine, they may throw more in
Actually,
than.
usually yes, and if you have more sugar, it actually ties up some of the sulfur, so then you have to add even more. But the biggest sulfur amount, and I actually talked to the guy who does box wine for Gallup, that actually has more than twice of what would normally be used in a bottle. But there's a government limit, so you can't go above 300 parts per million in the US and 200 parts per million in Europe. So sometimes people will say that, well, in Europe they use less sulfur, but honestly, most of our wines have less than 100 parts, and we want to keep it as low as possible. You can taste it.
Yeah. And sometimes I do get headaches.
Yeah, I get migraines,
Yeah.
and I think I have an ethanol breakdown. I think I have a damaged gene when ethanol is broken down to all these different compounds. Somewhere in that process, something's going wrong with my body. Because I taste unsulfured wine. I actually don't sulfur my wines for the first year for red wines. And sometimes I'd be like, oh, I didn't get a headache. And then like the next month I'd taste through all the unsulfured barrels. Oh, damn, I got a full headache again. I think I know what it is, and then I keep realizing it's more complex than.
And then the other thing is I've seen organic wines. That's just it's all the same,
We should
but
talk
the
about
grapes
that.
are organic.
Well, see, wine made from organic grapes is different than organic wine. And we really screwed up in the US with the labeling of those two things.
Okay.
Organic wine actually doesn't have added sulfites for
Right.
the most part.
But there's
wine
still
made
some.
from there's naturally like a few parts per million that occur from the yeast, but it's in a very bound form. And actually, there's a lot of research still to be done about whether we can separate these things in our body. I'm waiting to find out about that because I think my headaches could possibly hinge on some of that, but still waiting on some of the science. But every wine will have a usually pretty minuscule amount of sulfur that just occurs from the yeast fermenting to alcohol.
So you're saying organic wines aren't made from organic grapes?
No, I'm saying organic wines must be made from organic grapes,
Okay.
but must also not have more than 10 parts sulfur total, which basically means you can't add any because there's a little bit that happens naturally.
Okay.
Wine made from organic grapes means that the vineyard was all organic, but there is nothing determining what happens in the winery.
Okay, okay. Because a friend of mine, a good friend, her father had a vineyard in LaPorte, Indiana. He's passed away since. They were Greek. I don't think it's been farmed in 30 years.
Oh.
But she can't drink wine, but she turned me on to organic wine.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I drink wine with her, but I can still drink other wines, and sometimes I determine the wine I buy. Now after this, I'll think about it more. If I spend a little more money, maybe it'll be a better wine, or,
There is that
You know.
discussion. If you're worried about sulfur, I would actually do a fruit test. And if you go to a big market, you can find like sulfured and unsulfured apricots, sulfured and unsulfured tomatoes, and those are actually much higher than wines are. I would do a side-by-side test of that. Like I'm going to eat an ounce of unsulfured sun-dried tomatoes, see what happens the next day in an ounce of sulfured sun-dried tomatoes, and you can clearly see the difference. Sulfured fruit and vegetables will always have much more vibrant color. The unsulfured stuff is always kind of brown as it oxidizes. That's what the sulfur really helps with.
interesting.
So that's a cheap and easy way to see if maybe there's a sulfur sensitivity. But it's complex in our body, the way our bodies interact with it.
Well, the other thing too now, I have a condition that I have to take a Claritin every day. And I'm wondering if because I have that in me, that maybe the wines aren't bothering me.
I would guess that, if your immune system and things like that are already spiked up, I know I can't drink at all when I have allergies because the headache just crushes me and I get it within about 10 minutes. So I have to be careful. If it's hay fever, or even actually, because I work a lot, if I haven't had a day off in 3 weeks, I'll pretty much go to not drinking at all. Like no more Budweiser kind
Yeah,
of thing. Just
and
a
I
couple
drink
ounces
beer.
of wine.
I'm okay with beer.
You're okay with beer? Okay.
But sometimes I just like wine. It's lighter and
Yeah. It's a little more fun. I don't think about the beer I'm drinking quite as much as the wine.
kind of a chill glass of wine. Beer, it's like loud, fun, whatever.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
But,
Different context.
yeah, I'm learning so much here, and I'm glad that you can explain this sulfur and organic.
I'm not a doctor, so.
No,
but
I
it is
understand.
complex, and it's definitely more complex than the discussions I see like sulfur will kill you.
Yeah.
No. There are like I think 3 out of 100,000 people, like they will have respiratory collapse if they ingest something. But
Yeah.
by now if something like that. But we also know as we get older, our bodies change and our tolerances for things changes. Suddenly, I'm just about 50 now, and I'm like, I wasn't allergic to this before.
I know.
And it's just crazy. It comes out 6 months later, like I can't eat Thai food anymore. What's going on?
Yeah. Well, it gets worse, believe me.
Oh, great.
But
Thanks.
I think maybe white wines are better for me than the red now. I think I've determined that.
I hear it both ways all the time, and I have no idea what the thread is. For my girlfriend can't drink white wines at all. She gets the headache. She drinks red all. She drinks me under the table every single night.
But the only thing is, when you go to just regular
Oh, yeah,
restaurants, not nicer, you can get Chardonnay and maybe Pinot. No, Chardonnay. Chardonnay's the only white wine. Yeah, but I don't think they put it on the menu in Indiana because people can't say it,
Different markets, different things.
Yeah, different, you're right. But there's always a red one. There's always like a Merlot and whatever.
Yeah.
Wine in front
So
of me,
that's
not drink.
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm gonna really remember now what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And when I pick out
It's like,
wine,
oh, man, you're
you know, I'll
Yeah.
look for where it's from, what's in
And
it.
we'll talk about that a little more.
Yeah.
The world of wine is so
And I
big,
like
and once you sort of move off of the grocery store shelf, it actually gets more interesting, but you have to invest a lot more time into it.
Yeah.
Plus and minus on that one.
Yeah, it's good. You're doing a nice job. I'm enjoying this.
Oh, thank you.
I'm getting smart.
Yeah, I kind of go.
White wine, I have a tendency to drink. I really do. Now, red wine, I can sip it. But white wine, if I like it, I get like it.
Well, yeah, look at her.
Yeah, you can just drink
I like that.
I don't think I did either. Well, you were smart.
Before you start, then you go into
Yeah.
Okay, okay, whichever, whichever.
The big topic was all the smoke from the wildfires,
Yes.
how it's affecting the grapes.
Oh, yes.
They figured out yet what kind of grape that is? It's a big topic.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. Still definitely an evolving science, and in fact, there's
Come all, it goes up, snarly,
between the Canadian nutritionists and the Australian
am I,
some of the
I'm
science.
honored to join you today.
And to honor him,
He's honorary.
Was it rock chalk?
Now he's
Something
Rock
else?
Jayhawk.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it. I was gonna say that to you yesterday, and I forgot I should see you, but I worked with
there's a lot still to evolve.
University of
People working
Kansas
on
was
ways
13.
to get it out.
And I
Of
always
the wine
baskets,
side,
I always
and
like
that
those
was
until I
one thing
said
I'm
it
interested
to
in
you,
and
and
now
now
seeing with
I,
it.
you know,
Uh,
yeah, and I got
is
part of that
random
university,
wildcard
because I got it, because I know what to do, so we're still going.
Okay.
During basketball season, the final
Yeah.
four and all
There
that,
are a
now
couple
I'm
of really
new,
good
I'm
ones
still.
that in fact for the
Maybe I
same.
should have worn my Jayhawk sweatshirt
Yeah.
and my cap with big Jayhawk on it.
I could have taken your pictures and look what I have to put up with here. Take
There are
it
some
away.
interesting red wines that
But,
seem like they wouldn't
yeah.
be-
Don't wear sweatshirts in Southern California too often, but
Darker red, kind
I
of
like to wear that when
in there.
people comment.
Right,
A couple of them.
It's fun, when you wear whatever and then you meet someone
In
and.
fact, they're showing great
Yeah,
resistance.
we'll be there, right off the
There's
edge of
there's
Kansas.
something called
My
a
sister and I,
blue
next door to next door.
Wow.
There's
So,
the different types of
we're looking forward to that. And I'll wear some of my stuff here.
Oh, sure.
sadly, biologists, plant people getting involved. So it's
Yeah,
it's getting really interesting.
Yes, exactly.
The one main
Yeah,
problem is
both
they're
of
just
us are in Kansas.
there isn't really a good, because of that very reason, nobody has a good predictive way to like sample my water.
56,
That's very disappointing. Yeah,
You can't even really know.
every day, there's peachy jam. All the way through.
That's what I'm doing.
And you're smart.
But wait,
And you're at this table.
Oh, I don't want to be morose.
and there's other things that should be showing.
We just ate a glass of wine, we just went on a break, I thought there
Another
were
whole variability factor that we all have.
No, there's
sensory
no
thresholds.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's really complex from, yeah, from, the
I guess this is my glass, that's yours.
getting and all those lines.
Yeah, I need some water. After
Yeah.
the cookies, so it's
Let's just hope it doesn't, it's not quite the same this year as the last couple of years.
I would have never thought.
There's, this late rain is good, there are also some people who believe it's in drier, warmer places.
I've always been on, which color trip? 5 or 6 or 7, really enjoying it.
Forestry management is changing.
Actually, we like to all like it.
I'm actually very curious about
Next one was to,
And I talked with these
Baltic
it's smoking effectively.
we had one,
There are all these other crops.
Yes, I got them. I just
Scientists.
really learned about the cradle what happened to the Native Americans.
Is it just a wildfire in the forest?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
is it city, unfortunately?
The actual fire
So all the chemicals
components.
that's in the city.
I met someone that's walking around the mountains.
Yeah. I know, I can
Great.
smell.
Someone doing the Appalachian Trail at H.H. And he had started,
Different sort of foresty stuff.
no, Georgia.
Out here.
And he invited 3 weeks to get really bad.
Couches.
I can't remember if it was Kadesh or Gatlinburg. Anyway, he was at that port, and his wife was
It's fascinating for sure.
I could claim that I did about 100 yards.
Yeah, I know, I did about 100 yards.
well, I saw about 100.
And please feel free to shout out any questions you might have also. Forgot to mention that. I think the most interesting part is discussion, not necessarily me yapping.
That chart that you showed, that is indecipherable. Where is it?
Here's the copy of the
Which one? The circular one or the winery steps?
The steps.
It's one of those OCD winery people. They actually, that's one of 14 charts that they have. I've never heard of this winery. I can actually, I'll try to, it's like Chateau, I think it might be Hiditsakis, it might be Greek. I just found it online. They actually have like 14 different steps all the way to bottling. I don't know why. It's a pretty amazing website though. If I have a way to get the information, I'll send Chris a link to it just in case anybody is so compelled to look at a granular analysis.
We think there ought to be a source.
Yeah, that's true. Unfortunately, I was throwing this together last night at 11 o'clock, so I didn't do a whole lot of that. But that's a good, I have a little bibliography or recommended reading books on the last page. I'll actually add a couple of the resources. I hadn't used that slide before, so it was new to me. I was like, what? Laid like a flow chart of all these things? Crazy. It couldn't pay me to make one of those. So. And I forgot there was one more slide, but just to wrap up, bottling, all sorts of choices going into bottling. Sometimes you do something called bottling a wine dirty, when there's still a little bit of yeast cell in there. Something like champagne, where you make a still white wine, maybe you age it in barrels for 5 years on the lees, which are all the dead yeast cells. They're very high acid wines, but they need that yeast to break down autolytic stuff. You get polysaccharides and all these really interesting amino acids evolve out of those over the course of 5 years. And then you do the stuff that makes it carbonated. So there are different styles, you know, wine is an old tradition. There are lots of different ways to approach it. For me and the bigger reds that we make, there's something called racking, where you take the wine from one barrel to another and you take it off the sediment. It sort of helps clarify the wine and get it cleaner and brighter. I don't rack anymore on all but 2 of the reds. And one of them stays in the exact same barrel for 3 years. Never move it. Sometimes if it needs air, I will pump it into a drum and then back into the same barrel. But I've sort of evolved how I do things. Now that affects things down the road. And the reason I wanted to mention this slide is just this thing right here, reduction versus oxidation. And this gets a little bit technical, but this actually really is on topic for the wines that you drink. Because we have this new style of very fresh winemaking, we're able to get whites fast, pristinely into bottles. I assume everybody has had a screw cap bottle of wine before. Just a quick, you're done. There are $100 bottles under screw caps now. There are a lot of $50 Organ Pinots under screw cap. It's been a big move up there. New Zealand, I believe, is 100% screw cap now, from their most expensive bottle to their cheapest. And what's interesting about that is that it prevents oxidation. And reduction is sort of the opposite of oxidation. That's important because screw caps don't really breathe. They can breathe a little bit, but sometimes you'll pop open a bottle. This certainly happens with older reds with corks, but sometimes you get a white, you crack it open, and it's a little bit stinky. When a wine is reduced, it goes into this sort of, and I hate using the word sulfur because there are all sorts of different forms of sulfur, and sulfiting wine is not the same as a sulfur smell. But you can have some kind of a danky, swampy, musty smell to the wine, and that can be reduction. That can happen with reds, it happens with whites. I won't tell you what this pink is, this particular bottle. It's starting to change now, but this had a different cork material than all the other bottles, a micro, non-breathable cork. Stinky for the first 20 minutes. The ones under a different, more porous natural cork, all fine, pretty roses, the whole deal. And it's just because of that sort of, there's an equilibrium that happens in wine. Too much air, or too much oxygen, it gets oxidized, gets brown, gets tired, kind of leathery. You know an old wine when you drink it, it's kind of like, tired is really a good way to describe it. A lot of wines, when you open the bottle, show reduction. And that will change. Just let it breathe. A lot of things that might seem like a defect out of the bottle can actually really clear themselves up within 5 minutes with a little bit of air exposure. Especially with more expensive wines that are made to age. There's some areas too, I was noticing at the wine shop that a lot of the Chablis that we had, so northern France, cooler climate, and some of the white Burgundies, so same Chardonnay grape but a little south of the Chablis area, were really stinky from one of the vintages when you first open them. And there's something about that vintage and how much oxygen the wine could absorb and how they made the wine, that it really needed like 20 minutes of air, and then it was beautiful. This happens a lot. It happens with big Bordeaux wines that need to breathe. It doesn't happen with those $10 Safeway bottles or just quick consumption sort of commodity bottles, because that stuff is all calculated for equilibrium, ready to drink. But if you get some of the bigger, bold reds, Petite Syrah can be very prone to reduction. It can be like stinky and not very expressive, not very fruity. After 10 minutes, it can totally change. Some wines, if you've ever heard of Barolo, northern Italy, very expensive. Barolo, the king of wines, the wine of kings, blah blah blah. Generally, if you're gonna spend $90 on a Barolo wine, it's with the caveat that you're gonna age it for 10 years. It's just expected when you do that you know that. I'm sure the Bordeaux Chateau tell you the same thing. But think about that wine being cooped up in the bottle for, if you're buying it and it's already 4 years old before you even get it, you're gonna let it age for 10 years, 14 years, just in this little stuffed up thing. It may need some air to reawaken itself and to become floral and aromatic. So reduction is important because a lot of times if you just sip a wine the second after you pour it, you can think that it's bad or off, and it just needs time. Especially some of us that, some of the wines I'm bottling, making, it's with the knowledge that they're gonna be a little stinky and need air down the road. And that's just part of the game with that particular grape. We've got a couple like that. there's some grapes like Barbera, which can tend to have a bit of a burnt rubber smell that's actually chemically part of the grape. It's part of its DNA signature. A little bit of air helps with that. If we deprive it of too much air while it's aging, we can exacerbate it. If you expose it to too much air, you can either oxidize it, or there's this weird thing with reduction where you sort of inoculate it and then it comes back even stronger later. So reduction is a very weird issue. It's kind of fluid. I'm just throwing it out there with the general thought that if it's more than a $10 quick grab-and-go wine, give it time. I think part of the enjoyment of wine, for me, I actually like opening bottles that aren't ready to drink yet, or whatever they say, and seeing how it evolves in the glass over the course of 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Some wines are actually better the second day. Some of those Barolos need a full day of air to fully awaken. Brunello, which is the top of the Sangiovese ladder in Italy, can be the same way. Priorads, so Spanish area that a lot of Bordeaux viticulturists went to in the 1900s with phylloxera. Those wines can be very like cooped up and tight, and you're like, there's nothing here. There's no fruit. I can't smell anything. You come back 4 hours later, and it's all licorice and flowers and amazing. But the wine is a living thing. It's like cheese. If you keep it wrapped up tightly in plastic and it's a cheese that still needs to evolve, it actually needs air. So that's one of the reasons to keep your cheeses in paper, unless it's something like Parmigiano Reggiano that's been aged 3 years already. So it's a whole sliding fluid world out there. And just one last note, a lot of these wines that quickly come out, Beaujolais Nouveau hits the market like 6 weeks after it's picked, I think. And that's kind of a casual, fun, fruity wine. But they're still going to be bottle shocked. When you bottle a wine, it needs to go through this process of refinding itself. It's kind of traumatic for the wine. Whites, not so much, but reds really get jumbled up. I know our big reds need a year in bottle before they refine their equilibrium. Painfully long time. But we hand bottle things. If I could do 400 bottles a minute, it might be different. Yeah, we should have spit cups there. If you need anything, just let Chris or I know for you. But getting to tasting, one thing to always keep in mind is that your nose is amazingly sensitive and gets burned out super fast. If anybody has done a lot of wine tasting, like 10, 15, 20 wines, do you ever notice like you feel like it all starts to taste the same? You get this sort of, and it actually takes a lot of concentration to really smell something, right? I mean, if you're really digging into a wine, your partner across the table has challenged you to describe 10 things. Like, that's exhausting. That really is some serious mental cogs churning. There's mental exhaustion, but your nose really does exhaust itself. That's why when you walk into a new room or some new area, or your first smell of something, it's so vibrant, and after 30 seconds you can't smell it anymore. And that's a good thing, because the world is full of smells we don't want to be smelling all the time. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to tasting wines. I actually do think of tasting as a circle, just in the sense that when I pick up a glass, swirl, sniff, there's sort of the initial thing, then you taste, and then there's sort of an evolution, and then a re-sniff. So that first impression is usually pretty important, and then you sort of bring in the information you get in your mouth. You smell in 2 different ways. There's the nose, but then there's also the retronasal, up through the roof of your mouth actually connects to your nose, and you smell things both of those times. As wine crosses your palate, some of those molecules will actually change though. So they're both super important. And then you just want to practice a little bit of memory work with your wines too. And this goes back to appreciating regions, or maybe, there are so many grape varieties out there I've never heard of. There are at least 600 identified in Italy. I think Portugal has 300. France we tend to think of as being kind of monochromatic, but there are all these weird little Loire Valley, you know, then we have a name for something like Pinot St. George, which is this in the Loire Valley, but there's only 10 acres there. There are all sorts of weird grapes in the south of France that just one farmer happens to have. We had one wine in the shop. The guy, the winery, the vineyard is on like an 8-acre island. And it's all grapes that nobody's at, like geographically isolated physically by water. And it, just bizarre experience. Like, I don't know any of these grapes. They aren't grown anywhere else. This smells like no other combination of things I've had before. In France, you know, it's not all just Pinot and Cabernet. Because of that long historical evolution of grapevines. They mutate, they change, they interbreed. Sometimes they cross in weird ways that you would not expect. To go back to Petit Syrah, that is a combination of Dr. Durif created that. So in Australia, the grape is actually called Durif, not Petit Syrah. It's a combination of Syrah and a grape called Pelorsan. Neither of those grapes is particularly tannic. But somehow this dark tannic monster came out of them. And lots of those grape crossing hybrid things act in ways you would never expect. Not to get too far off topic though. If you really want to get into serious wine tasting, you gotta learn how to spit. Just so you're absorbing less ethanol. You'll still absorb a little bit sublingually, but getting comfortable spitting allows you to go to bigger tastings and taste 40, 50, 100 wines. Gotta take a break, but it definitely ups your game factor. And just as a pro tip, if you go to a tasting room and spit, the staff there will always treat you like a VIP. Because they'll think you're serious. They'll think you're a reviewer. They just threw out the word blog or something like that once or twice. And they'll kind of like, you know, answer more questions more quickly and open extra bottles. So. The shower is a great place to practice it. It is, I will admit, I am not a good spitter. There is a little bit of subconscious competition among wine professionals about accurate spitting and speed and velocity and art. There was a guy who works in San Francisco who likes to spit to, you know, like 8 feet away, perfect, and we're always like, oh, I hate that guy. One of the best wine tasters I know, she just came out with a really good book. I would recommend Catherine Follis. She came up here to do some wine judging at one point. Fantastic palate, amazing person. She cannot spit. It is so embarrassing for her. So she has a whole thing where she sort of like hides her face with a bucket. You know, you just got to get comfortable with wherever you're particular. I do tend to dribble the first couple of times, but practice it. It's actually, you'll learn more from tasting 20 wines when you have the opportunity than 5 and getting hammered really fast. So, I think it's a valuable tool within this context. It's a weird skill though, and the first few times are embarrassing. Like I don't come from the spitting in public culture, so it takes a while to feel okay in a room with 100 people. You know. And of course, they never empty out the spit buckets fast enough, so they got to run around. The cups are good for that too.
Well, I have a question. So is this 1 spit or 2 sips? 2 sips?
That would depend. See, this for me, if I'm going to a big professional tasting and I'm here to taste 100 wines today. I would probably drink only a quarter of this. But there's a certain ratio at which, this is gonna get gross, if you don't take enough in, you have too much salivary mixture with that, and you can't spit effectively. I'm really parsing my words carefully, because you need a certain level of fluidity to eject it effectively. So you got to get enough, but not like a big mouthful. Actually, for me, tasting a big mouthful is difficult because it sort of skews all the texture. I feel like I can't really aromatize things properly. I do a little bit of slurp. You'll see a lot of people slurp. that's just how I did it. The first guy I worked for at a wine shop, that's how he did it, so that's how I do it. There are people who literally open their mouth. There's a guy I know who actually gargles, which is very strange. He's like a big hairy Greek guy, so I'm not going to tell him. Like, but there are all sorts of different styles. But you want to kind of agitate the wine and help release the volatile sort of stuff up the back of your mouth, so that it goes up to your smell bud, basically. So any way you can do that helps. I'm not convinced that if you don't slurp, that you're gonna miss out on the wine. It may add like maybe 10%, 15% more oomph to what you're smelling. I don't think it's a radical difference though. Like you're missing out on a whole world if you don't develop a slurping style. Just a quick note at the color of wine. Color is cool. I feel like sometimes we don't appreciate that enough, although with the new world of rosés, people have kind of become more in tune to color. Different grapes have different colors, different hues. Looking at the red glass, they can transition from the middle to the edge. We call them meniscus. And different grapes, if you're just looking at a grape, there's certain, or a wine in a glass, there's certain clues to the grape that you can get just by looking at it. Young wines tend to have much more vibrant color, whereas the older ones get more kind of dense, maybe a little more brown, because of that slow oxidation process. If somebody blind tastes you on a Pinot Gris, it's a grape that has sort of a dark silver skin. Sometimes you can actually look at the white wine and you'll see that it looks silvery around the edge. There are people that say that they can tell Malbec because it gets watery and pink around the edge. So it's a grape that has a lot of color but a very thin skin. I'm not sure that I believe that those are necessarily directly related. But there are little clues and hints and interesting things to know about it. Nebbiolo will often be orange at that meniscus. It'll go from like a pretty salmon pink to like this kind of awkward and almost yellow color. Again, that's kind of what the grape skin looks like, actually. Very lightly colored. The funny thing is that a red wine and a white wine, they're going to sort of end up in the same place. If you've seen 15, 20-year tawny ports, those were red ports that turned brown. This color kind of just eventually falls out of it. A really old white wine will kind of go to the same place. So, and if you have an old bottle, either somebody brought it to a party or something you've been hanging on to, sometimes just looking at some of these old oxidized white wines, you can say, oh, this is so far beyond gone, and then you taste it and it's become a completely different sort of wine. Caramely, nutty. Sometimes it'll be completely off too and smell like alcohol factory or something like that. But the wine itself the grapes can actually handle that oxidation and become something wonderful. Some of the old Bordeaux's they get very mushroomy, very brown, but those mushroom notes can be really fascinating. The one area that can get confusing is the world of orange wine. So you can have, say a Chardonnay that's made in orange wine style, and it comes out looking like this when it goes into the bottle. The skins have color. It's been sitting on the skins, leaching color out. It can look very not as expected. It can be a really cool experience though. You get all sorts of really interesting flavor profiles, orange zest, lemon zest, spicy. A lot of times they're actually like, coriander, like German spice box baking kind of stuff. It's really cool.
So is it a combination of red and white grape? Or is it
No,
red grape,
white grape.
white grape?
Yeah, so orange wines are all white grapes.
Okay.
They become orange colored with the long aging. And they're also aging them on the stems. So they also have all this dried leaf kind of flavors. I didn't mention the winemaking discussion just before the break. But one of the big choices for us small, like artisanal producers, is whether or not we do whole cluster fermentations. Do we, as they do in Burgundy, and it really is sort of a Burgundian thing, but more and more of us will keep a portion of the grapes on the stems instead of taking them all off through a machine, and ferment the stems in there for 10, 12, 15 days as well. Changes the flavor profile. I do it in a couple of different wines. I don't go above 25% whole cluster, just because then for me it overpowers what I'm looking for in the grapes. It's really cool for small artisanal producers to do 100% foot-stomped whole cluster fermentations. One of the guy named Matthew Rorick, who's considered like the great hope of California winemaking, every single grape he makes, and he has probably 25 different bottlings, all 100%, and he, they're all in a half-ton bin, and he jumps in on them, stomps around, and that's it. He ferments them. So stems, leaves. I actually will do sometimes a mix of because stems are sometimes green, different areas, different grapes, you get different stem ripeness. I've actually done a little bit, like 10%, fresh, put it in, make my friends stomp on it because I don't like doing that. He likes sticky feet. And then I dried some of the stems and added them back later, and then dried another batch for a week, and then just sort of dumped them in tea bag style until I got a little bit of that sort of fall leaf pile sort of thing, and took them out. A little more controllability. Just an experiment. For me, it was a good way to control some of the fruitiness and to knock it down a little bit so it felt a little more Pinot French-ish. So, lots of different things can be done out there. But looking at wine, when you get something really cloudy and hazy, and you know that it shouldn't be, like a safe grocery store wine, something's probably wrong with the bottle. Take it back, get your money back, and get it replaced. If it's an artisanal fancy bottle, if it says unfined, unfiltered, something like that, there may be some sediment in there. There really isn't anything sedimenty that's going to hurt you in a wine. No human pathogens can live in wine. It's too much acid. So nothing's going to hurt you. The whole concern over whether or not the little crystals, which are tartrate crystals, some of the crystallized acid basically, that happens in some grapes are more prone to that than others. Kind of looks like glass. I have never ever heard of a legitimate broken glass problem in bottling. It just doesn't happen. But I have 2 wines that leave those, so don't worry about it too much. In general though, I hate to be wasteful, I usually, unless it's a very fresh young wine or rosé that I can see, the bottom of it, an aged red wine, we just generally don't pour the bottom out. If it's an older wine, you can just assume that there will be some sediment. It happens naturally. There are also little screens that you can pour your wine through. Some grapes do tend to produce more sediment than others, like Barbera, because of its acid levels. Petite Syrah can also have a lot of gritty sediment. It happens. The 80-20 rule. I don't know, I have a problem with this one. So 80% of your wine enjoyment comes from your nose, 20% from your palate. I don't believe that. It's definitely a stronger interaction of the 2 different things. You might be paying attention more to one than the other. A really floral white wine that's sort of all about the way it smells. I'm going to pay less attention to how it's feeling in my mouth. Big red Bordeaux thing, I'm kind of there for the texture on that one, and then maybe for some of the smells. But no doubt, smell is super important. It is linked to that emotional part of the brain. That's why you get that weird thing where the cookies baking reminds you of your mother's oven 40 years ago, something like that. Sometimes these smell memories can be kind of emotional, be tied to them. It's a very cool thing. But the nose does adapt. ideally, in a perfect world, you would have 90 seconds, maybe 60 to 120 seconds between each real smell that would allow you to like completely reset your nose. And of course, it rarely resets, but you know, if you have the opportunity, say you're in a tasting room, had a few, and they have a deck outside, and you can walk outside for a minute and sort of get fresh air, you'll get a good sort of nasal reset. I know at tastings, I have to take a break after an hour, and like I just kind of like, 'cause I seriously start just like, where's the sunlight? Because if you get so focused on what you're tasting, that like even just being able to smell or stand in sunlight helps you sort of reset that taste or that sense of smell. I will actually sometimes, a person clued me onto this, go to the sunlight, kind of shake it off, and then smell your arm a couple of times. So we sort of have that, we don't know that we smell ourselves, but we kind of do. Has a weird grounding effect, sort of helps reset things a bit. I know other people that have variations of that they use. Water does not seem to help that much. Especially if you're tasting red wines and you're getting kind of that big dry red sensation. Drinking water, you've probably noticed like it doesn't actually reset and clear your palate. If you can find some bubbly mineral water or something like that, that can be helpful. But I will actually avoid water because it tends to skew the next couple of tastes for me. Sometimes finding just like, if you've been tasting reds, just go find like a cheap, bright white wine to swish and spit with, and that can sometimes really just kind of settle the nerves a bit. So we do all smell things differently to some degree. We are more in tune to certain smells, molecules than others. Just kind of think of the cilantro model. And I'm always confused by that one because I hated cilantro as a kid, and now I love it, but I think it's incredibly powerful and you have to be careful with it. So there's this whole issue of neuroplasticity too. I hated mushrooms when I grew up because they came out of a can. It wasn't until I started cooking that like, oh, chanterelles, what's this? Oh, porcini, what's this? It's like, oh, okay, I'll take mushrooms now, thank you. And that's a combination too, external, internal features. As long as we're not really allergic or overly sensitive to something, you can probably learn to appreciate something. There are a lot of things in wine that I don't actually like flavor-wise, but I can find them interesting, and that's engaging for me. I'll take an interesting wine over a wine that smells like all the things I like any day. Just for me, that interest, that something is engaging. So some people are a little more hedonistic. They want the coffee and chocolate, blah, that kind of thing, and that gives them the most pleasure. I'm a little more analytical, so I like weird little bits and pieces here and there, and sense of balance. It's all fair game. Just knowing yourself is part of it. And it's always bugged me too, especially when I was working at a private club. The chef there seasoned really aggressively, and it's always like, old people need lots of salt. And I realized towards the end of my tenure there that it's just this jerk that needs all the salt. Like, there are plenty of people complaining about the sodium levels, and he just wasn't a very good chef, and didn't add, you can bump up the acid in a dish and use less salt and make a brighter, more flavorful dish in a lot of circumstances. Maybe you just need to throw in a little basil. He was just a salt and pepper kind of guy, like, what spices do you want? Pepper. Which is kind of a cultural thing, like that's a culinary side is just, we kind of over pepper. Just pepper is so common and ubiquitous that we forget that in another culture, pepper would be like us putting cinnamon on everything. So it's kind of fascinating, those little things where you sort of get out of your own skin. But yeah, sure, taste declines with age. I think that's more like mechanistic taste buds kind of stuff. I have never seen anything that indicates that your ability to smell wine decays over age. And I certainly don't think that the mental processing somehow gets worse. if anything, I think you can do more with less. I think you can smell things, parse things out, and create more interesting connections between flavors and smells. So, I do, in my life, I try not to, sodium is not necessarily great for us. Although if everything is healthy and you're drinking enough water, it seems like our bodies process it just fine. If you're cooking and need to knock down the amount of sodium, work with adding a little bit of acid to foods, tomatoes. When I was in my serious fine dining phase, one of the chefs I worked for very famous New York City people. We always had an alkaline and an acid liquid on hand. And we would balance each dish, either adding tomato water with some spices or this sort of alkaline onion, garlic stuff, and then salt on top and season. And it was very layered. You could build up all this stuff. And ultimately, we were using less salt. So, it's just an interesting side note, and that will come back up with wine pairing, because we can use those things to construct pairings that work better with wine. Let's go ahead and sniff the first wine. So, mechanics of tasting. So if people judge you by spitting, they will also judge how you hold the glass and how you swirl. I am not a good swirler. Generally though, if you want to be a classy taster, you hold the stem lower, and when you swirl, you kind of just lightly, make a circular motion with the top. Pretty much every place I've ever been in, when they see somebody holding a glass like this, they know that, rookie. Fingerprints, warming. Now occasionally, it's not uncommon for a white wine to be too cold when you get it. So maybe you're kind of cupping it to warm it up with the heat from your hand. But generally you want more like delicate, you don't necessarily need the pinky, but if you want to engage it, that's fine. If you're uncomfortable swirling, definitely a flat surface allows it to start. Then you just sort of, but also the shape of the glass, the amount of the glass. I hate it when I'm at a cheap restaurant, you get like a 6-ounce glass with 5 ounces of wine in it. And it still has lip prints on it. There should be, ideally you want to have at least half the glass empty. So if you have a fancy Bordeaux glass, a glass pours 5 to 6 ounces. And if it's a nice one, it's probably at least a 17-ounce glass. So there's a lot of swirl space. In theory, you want to collect sort of all the aromas in the bowl. And that's what you're doing when you swirl, is sort of you're increasing the surface area. This wine has CO2 in it, so you'll notice little bits of bubbles. But if you smell it, and this is not going to be a powerful, pungent wine to smell, but what do you pull out of it? And you get the little bit of alcohol, because it's way too warm. And that's the thing with white wines. Alcohol is that it gets closer to room temperature, you smell the alcohol more. The colder the wine is, the less you smell it, but also the less floral kind of stuff you get out of it. So temperature actually matters a little bit. But I think I get a little bit of like soft strawberry fruit, maybe. Maybe there's a little bit of peach in there. Plum? That could be, yeah. See that? This is a red grape that has a pretty broad spectrum of flavors if a red wine was being made out of it. So it's kind of interesting to see it made as a rosé. I won't tell you what